Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Allow Us to Explain from Our National Conversation. I'm your host, Michaela Eidelberg, and I'm a journalism intern here at ONC, and I'm joined by my co-host.
Hi, I'm Alex Julian. I'm a podcast intern here at ONC.
So in this episode of Allow Us to Explain, we're going to be talking about 15-minute cities, and we're joined by two panelists, John Reuter and Nita Iyer. If you'd like to introduce yourself, John, go ahead.
Hello, I'm John Reuter. I'm the Vice President of the Board and a Strong Towns Fellow at Strong Towns. We are an organization focused on helping people build strong and resilient communities across the country.
Thanks so much, John. And Nirati?
Hi, I'm Nirati. I'm a core content writer intern.
Awesome. And again, thank you guys so much for joining us. And potentially a third panelist will pop in, so we'll keep you guys updated if they join. And just to jump right into it for our first topic, can you just explain, John, what is a 15-minute city and how is it beneficial to the average person? I know it's mostly for convenience and things like that, but can you just dive a little bit deeper into that?
Sure, and let's first start, like, a 15-minute city is a relatively new buzz term for an idea that's been around for literally thousands of years, right? So where does this name come from? Let's talk about that first, and then I'm sure we'll get into like the controversy around it too, because this has become a focal point for discourse around how we build our places and about how people get around and all those kind of things too. It's really become very partisan and divisive, right? And I feel like, that's really what you guys all focus on these conversations, right? Is how do we actually bridge these divides and how do we make sure these things that have divided us actually get cured? And that's a major focus of our work at Strong Towns too. So in terms of what a 15-minute city actually is about, is this advocacy for this idea that you should be able to live in a neighborhood where you can walk or bike to get to most of the things you need to live a great life within 15 minutes, right? And what do we mean by that? We mean you can get to recreation, you can get to a park, you can get to the medical stuff, you can get an appointment to your dentist, right? You can go and buy groceries, the school, right, where your kids go. You can actually get to that within 15 minutes by biking or walking, right? So that's the core of this idea, is a 15-minute city is really about how we build our places and how we make them accessible by foot or bike, in an easy way.
Thank you so much, John. And Nita, if you would like to have your own definition of a 15-minute city or it's how it's beneficial, go right ahead.
I think the way John defined it is pretty good. I mean, as far as my experience goes, I pretty much live in one. I mean, I live in a pretty small area. But and I didn't really as John was saying, it's been around, like it's just a buzzword right now, but it's been around this idea for so long. And only when the topic of this podcast came up, I was like, oh wait, I pretty much live in one. But it's not really prevalent in my everyday life, and especially when my family was moving here, no one really considered the fact that everything is, I mean, obviously everything's walkable, but no one ever advertised it as, oh, it's a 15-minute city. So I think it's a pretty new thing that I would use to describe my town.
And you live in a smaller town, you were saying?
Yeah, I live in a smaller town.
Yeah, that's a really important point here, right? Is that 15-minute cities can happen in a neighborhood in a big city, or it can actually be a small town, and they can look very different than each other, right? The key is that walkability and that bikeability, but they're not just one model where all of them are built in exactly the same way or look the same or have the same types of people. It's actually a model that's been built for thousands of years in lots of different environments and places, and it could be a small town or it could be a big city.
Yeah, and it's actually changed a lot since I've moved here too. So, yeah.
And then one last general question before I pass on to Alex. Why do you think 15-minute cities has been popularized so recently instead of considering it's been an idea for a while?
Well, has it been popularized or has it become controversialized during this period of time, right? Because I think both are true. And I think both lead back to the same event, actually, where this is entered our dialogue in this way. And I think it's very linked to the pandemic. And there was a period of time where we were all stuck at home. And it made us think a lot more about what it was like to be stuck at home. What did it mean? What was right around us? What could we walk to? Where was the park we could walk to? Where were the places we could be? How close were we to other people that we liked, right? That we could get together with outdoors in the immediate environment. You saw people get very focused on their homes in that time period. People think about what appears behind them during a Zoom conversation, or what's the space like? How am I going to get my home office to work? Or how am I going to make this place a little easier to how am I going to use the space in a different way, right? And we also thought around that space immediately around our homes too, right? So that's part of it, is just thinking about becoming a little closer to home and thinking in those ways. The other thing that happened, though, is we got locked down, right? In many places across the world, people lost a sense of freedom. They lost a sense of mobility during that time there too, right? And so that made them start to become much more suspicious about government, much more distrustful of institutions, right? Things had not worked, right? We're like, why are we getting sick? Why can I not travel, right? There's all this just sense of a trapped in freedom. And so it led to a lot of things being mapped onto this concept of fear and concerns, and a sense of, oh my gosh, you're going to lock me in a 15-minute space. And if that 15-minute space, that circle around you, wasn't walkable, wasn't bikeable, that sounded pretty awful, right? It sounds like you're gonna get contained in your neighborhood. And we just had this example where government had contained us in our neighborhoods, right? In many parts of the world. And so there's I think there's a lot of dismissiveness people have to the conservative and right-wing backlash to a 15-minute city concept, but I actually think it comes from a really understandable place. Why people are feeling that way, what generates those feelings. And I think there's some really important education we need to do about how a 15-minute city can actually expand our sense of freedom rather than make us feel boxed in and limited in that way that the pandemic and the trauma from that, right, did for so many of us, because that was really tough.
Yeah, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I definitely feel like, I mean, the pandemic really made people question, I can't really go anywhere. And I mean, that obviously gave rise to a lot of people talking about the idea of this, but as well as um thinking of creating more or expanding on them, there also came a lot of pushback. And for me during the pandemic, really I didn't really feel like it really affected how things got back to normal for me living in a 15-minute city. I mean, I definitely I mean, I can't compare it because I really didn't live anywhere else during the pandemic, but I definitely feel like I didn't feel as trapped as um some others. I mean, other people who I talked to and on the news and everything. Especially because as we were going back to normal, there are so many coffee shops, restaurants, etc. right nearby that I could just walk to. And also I live in a small area, as I mentioned, so it's obviously not as crowded. Living in a 15-minute city probably made me feel a bit safer because um kind of everyone is in one place, and um I really wasn't interacting with others as other people as much, but which can make people feel a bit alone, but for me it probably made me feel a bit safer.
Okay, so what would the convenience be through public transportation and infrastructure in a 15-minute city?
What would be the convenience is what the question is, or sort of how does it make it easier to get around? I mean, everything's 15 minutes away, right? And we can use public transit to make it even better. You don't have good public transit if you don't have walkability and bikeability, right? If you can't get to the bus stop, it doesn't really matter if there's a bus stop there. If you can't get to the rail station, right, it's not all that helpful. So it's that connectivity that's really valuable there that then lets you connect to the wider environment around you, right? And it's a really key way to get there. It really is that freedom to be able to get around without having to get in a car. And I think we often talk about that in an abstract way, and I just want to get really specific about what that means, right? I think about so many parents I know who have to spend a lot of time helping their kids get to events here and get to events there. And right, there's a lot of time spent in commute here. It's the freedom of being oh, my kid can actually walk down to their ball game at the park, right? And actually go and play with kids there. They can actually go and see a neighbor and a friend over here because we live in a place where it's safe to actually walk from one place to another. It's that capacity to actually live near where you work, so you can actually walk to work instead of having an hour commute both way. You actually spend more time at home, right? It's the ability where you could make do with less cars, right? So you might only need one car instead of two cars in your family because both people have to head off in different directions or take the kids here or there in different times. Now people can actually make more of those trips by foot or by bike. So I think that's how it ties in, right, to that sense of mobility, to that sense of public transit, and to really that freedom. of not having to have that expense of a car, or certainly not having this expense of 2 or 3 or 4 cars in many households, right? Because if you live in many environments, you're stuck, right? Without that car. Without that car, you don't get to go anywhere. And that's a pretty expensive price to put on actually buying freedom. Cars are not cheap. More cars are not cheap. Insurance is not cheap, especially for a teenager. And so, the more that we can make it so people have that ability to connect with each other and have community, the better. And of course, public transit just expands that even further. You can get to the core of the city, right? And get to the concert or get to the other event. It's just a great way to make that even, to even extend that sense of mobility you have within that immediate neighborhood to even go further. You can get to, you can get even further out, right? You can get to another city, right? That way too. You can take a train and get to another city and be in another 15-minute city. So there's real power and value to that in terms of extending that reach.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a lot more sustainable. As John was saying, you don't really need to rely on cars that much. And for me in my area, there's also for some reason really not that much public transport, but I know definitely growing up, my parents are both working. It definitely helped them that I could walk to school and I could go places, like do pretty much whatever I want, and they don't have to drop everything to drive me there or anything. And it's definitely a lot more convenient because I used to live in a city, and a pretty big city, and I just know if I was there, I definitely wouldn't feel that sense of freedom that I do here, that I can just go anywhere. And also it's a lot safer because my parents know that I'm close by, and that really a lot of the places that I need to go or would want to go, say like with my friends or someone, they know that I'll be nearby, and if something happens, then they're right there.
It reminds me, hearing Nari, what you were saying reminds me of living in a small town. And so it's the opposite. You're going living in a big city before. I'm thinking about living in a small town in North Idaho. I was actually on the city council when I was 24 of a small town, Sandpoint, Idaho, 6,000, 8,000 people, hotly debated topic because it depends how much money you get from the census. But it was a 15-minute city. I lived in the downtown of this small town, in North Idaho, rural area, but the town had like a traditional streetscape, a traditional main street, right? You could walk to the Canada Theater, which was the old historic theater. You could walk down to City Beach, where we're on a lake. You could walk to the hospital. You could walk to restaurants, right? You had all those things. And then we put in place the Spot Bus, which is just a little bus system that connected us to the 3 other towns in this rural community along this lake. And I didn't get why it was important at the time. I'm like, I got what I need right here. And everyone had a car, right? You could get, if you need to get out to the mountains or get further to another town nearby. It was a rural area, so that's what you did. And I just wondered, like, why were we investing these hundreds of thousands of dollars to build this public transit, this bus? And the mayor shared with me a story at the time after we'd done it, and she had advocated very fiercely for it. And I said, okay, let's go for it. But afterwards, she said to me, John, I want you to understand why this is so important. And she took me over to her part of the neighborhood, and she showed me the bus stop across from where she lived. And right near there was a home for domestic violence shelter, where women were putting their lives back together after fleeing really terrible situations. And she said, I see every day 2 women come to that stop. And I went over and talked to them. I asked them, why are you riding this bus? And they said, well, this has given us this freedom because now we can get to our jobs in Ponderay, 1 town over, right? Now we can actually get over there. We can't walk that far. We can't afford a car at this point right now to get there. And it gave them this economic freedom, right? And so I think we often think of, I think we often miss how much public transit is again about that freedom, right? And how it changed those 2 women's life in this way and let them actually build things together, actually build an economic future, actually get back on their feet because of that bus. And so these things are really important, not just in our cities and in our big cities, right? But also important in our small towns in terms of creating that connectivity that can really change people's lives.
How can public transportation become more accessible and affordable in 15-minute cities?
I'm happy to talk about it. How do we make it more affordable? Well, there are 2 parts to this question, right, that I think are really important. One, how do we make it affordable for people? And 2, how do we make it affordable for government, right, to be able to actually operate and do these kind of things? So I'm going to take them in the reverse order of the thing, because I think that making it affordable for government is actually key to making it affordable for people. So one, we don't expect roads to fully pay for themselves. We don't expect car infrastructure to fully actually cover its own costs. And I think that's an important place to start, right? We actually subsidize cars dramatically in this country and in countries across the world. Like, we put a lot of infrastructure into cars, and motorized users do not fully pay the cost of those roads. They just don't, right? And so, but at times we look at public transit and we're like, well, this needs to pay fully for itself. And that's not a fair standard, particularly because we know that public transit is actually really good for economic development, right? In the same way that roads, when correctly built, can be really good for economic development, right? But not always, but they can be if they're built correctly. And so, and public transit isn't always good for economic development, but it can be if it's built successfully. And when it creates that economic development, of course, it also creates government revenue that actually helps you support the public transit and have those things work. And so we think it's really important at Strong Towns that when we're thinking about public transit, that we're building it from a place to another place, right? And we're building it in an incremental way. And so we don't think you should take a philosophy of we're going to build it and then people come. I think that's actually a flawed idea in a lot of ways. We don't think that's a great idea with roads either, for that matter, or any transportation system. But to actually think, where is there already the demand? Where is there already a set of people where you have enough density, right? Enough people living around a stop, enough things happening there, enough interest there, who then are going to have interest in getting to another spot, so we can actually have those things connect together and create those connections between places. So that's really key to having to actually pencil out, right? Because then you also have the demand and everything else. And then for people, I think we have to really look at how to make public transit as affordable as possible. And we need to think about a few things about that. One, I'm a very occasional transit rider. It's fine. I can pay my, because I stay in my 15-minute city, but I can pay my $5 both ways, $5 in, $5 out, to get in the city of Boston, where I live inside of it, but on more towards the edge of it, right, to go downtown. But for other people, it's going to be more challenging. In Boston, we give free transit to kids, right? If you're a kid and you want to, so you can ride that to your school and get back and forth. That's really important. We can look at reduced rates for people too. So we need to think about how to make sure that most vulnerable users actually have access to it, and really be thinking about who we're charging and where we're charging, actually stopping people from using the transit, which isn't smart. Can we make it so that within certain areas, right, we're actually not having to be free to travel within from this stop to this stop, like the Portland system has long done, Portland, Oregon has done. So a lot of ways we can make transit more affordable for people by thinking smartly about what's actually driving profitability, what's actually just driving riders off of it. Because one of the great things about transit is riders attract ridership, right? Actually, getting more people on it is actually helpful to getting more people on it. It ends up working better. And so trying to build that critical mass is really important, and it actually benefits everybody. This is something this is a bigger theme about 15-minute cities that I'll wrap up here, this thought here, but I'll just say, I think we often think this idea of more people is going to harm our quality of life, when the reality is, if done correctly, if done in a gentle way, right, where we all share that growth together, it actually makes our neighborhoods more vibrant. It actually means more restaurants to go to. It actually means more fun bands and entertainment, and more people to show up to a ball game and to play sports and games with, right? It just means a more vibrant and economically successful place. So the same is true of public transit. And I just think we need to think that way, of more of having neighbors as a good thing, not an inconvenience. Again, when we build in that traditional development pattern, which we could talk more about if that's of interest, but I think that's part of where I'd go. So there's some answers to your questions, and just some other things I'm thinking about right now.
Okay, Narati, would you like to share your
Yes.
thoughts on it?
Yeah, sorry, my mic was not working and my Wi-Fi is glitching, but
That's okay.
yeah, to make it more accessible, I think we also need to figure out where it's needed. I think John also touched on this. From in and out and in and out of the city. So obviously, I think a lot of the main concern around 15-minute cities is that people can feel trapped and isolated, and also in turn, a lot of people don't spend, if you're looking at the benefits of a 15-minute city as not having to spend as much on individual transportation, then I definitely think a lot of people who need to go in and out, or say they want to leave for something, I think they're not really going to have too many options to leave by themselves. So I think we need to focus on transportation in and out of the city, um, especially since there's an emphasis on being able to walk or bike within the city, but also, I know in my town, like, there's really not that much public transportation, and I mean, I think there definitely can be. I mean, there are obviously school buses, etc., but for just general people, um, there really isn't that much. So I think the first step is to really just figure out where people need it because um, it's still like the idea of a 15-minute city. I mean, it's been around for a while, but calling it that and really focusing on them is relatively new. So I think we need to first figure out like what people want.
Sorry, for sure. I'm gonna jump in actually with a question of my own. So I'm from Chicago, and like our public transportation is very convenient and really great, I would say. And now I'm in LA as a USC student, and I've heard a lot of comments about how it's just like not as convenient, kind of burdensome, just because you can't really get everywhere with the public transport, or you have to take multiple buses and like trains and things like that. So for cities that are like Los Angeles, and they just kind of it's more of a burden to take public transport than just for like paying for an Uber or a Lyft. How, what would you like propose to city officials or like people that plan these routes to improve that?
To improve, I mean, I don't really know too much about lawmaking and planning, and I don't really have much experience in that, but um, if there's enough of an issue that people like go out of their way to avoid public transport, and as you're saying, it's not that convenient, really like the thing is, I mean, getting the people who um prefer Ubers and Lyfts, etc., to collaborate with those who design these routes, to come up with a solution that like really fits what they want. Um, because then again, if it's as a community, people are kind of avoiding public transport, and as John said, the more people ride public transport, the more people are gonna want to follow, right? So I think it's just about as a community, you have to really figure out what works for that individual community. Um, I mean, there's really no one way to fix it. I guess it's just if it's a big enough issue that people go out of their way to avoid it, then you really need to take the people who are avoiding it along with the people who plan it and work out a solution that is less tedious and more convenient to really promote the. I mean, it's the idea of a 15-minute city. One of the main things is sustainability. So if a city is walkable but people still need transportation, then that needs to be um, focused on because otherwise you're not really getting one of the main benefits of a 15-minute city.
For sure. And then John?
Well, LA is a city famous for traffic, right? And it's a problem they've been trying to solve for a long time is how do we solve this traffic problem? And the solutions that they've come up with make a lot of sense at first, right? Which is we cannot get our cars from this spot to this spot over here fast enough. Let's add more lanes, right? And we'll just keep adding another lane. And that lane gets filled up, we'll add another lane and we'll add another lane and we'll add another road here and we'll try to do this kind of thing there. It's to the point where it's difficult, right? There might be some places you still add some lanes, but it's pretty hard to keep adding lanes there. But here's the problem. It's induced demand. So there's this idea in transportation planning, right, where when you add additional lanes, people actually will fill those lanes, particularly at those key moments, right? And so they actually rearrange their trips because there's a level of waiting that they're willing to tolerate. And they'll still we have the peak hours, right? There are times where you can get around LA really fast in a car, right? There actually are moments where you find where LA by car is a 15-minute city. Those are the times when nobody's traveling, where nobody else is traveling, right? But you know when those times are if you live in LA that, oh, if I go at this time in the morning or I sneak in at this point, then I'll actually be able to get somewhere really fast. But those peak hours just get worse and worse and worse, right? And the adding more lanes actually hasn't worked at all. It's just made there so there's more people waiting the same amount of time or longer in their cars and creating more like these pressure points there that they put onto it. It creates all these problems. So what you need to solve the problem in LA is a change in thinking about the transportation problem. You need to say, you know what, we cannot build our way out of this with more auto infrastructure. It is not going to solve our transportation problem. And you need to start thinking about how do we shift more trips to other modes? Right? That's the key. And that could be a bicycle, that could be walking, that could be making sure people don't have to travel as far and can stay put. It could be making sure that housing is where people work, right? So you're shrinking those things. Land use is part of this. It could be adding public transit in some place and figuring out how to strengthen those systems. But it's really, and figuring out how to give them dedicated space so that they're moving faster. So, oh, there's a real incentive here to do these things. But it really is changing how we think about public investment, and not just doing the same thing over and over again that's just producing more traffic and not actually solving the problem.
And actually, speaking of investment, I'm going to jump into kind of the money side of it in a second. But again, like coming from Chicago to Los Angeles, like two big cities, there's also like, a lot of crime that comes with that. And also me coming to USC, the surrounding area isn't like as great all the time. So when it comes to walking and taking public transport, what would you say the city can invest into other things just to ensure like there's also safe transportation, you taking public transport, and people don't want to use their cars if they can safely walk to like, the park, or they can safely walk to the store or the bank. What were some things you would say about that? John, you can go ahead, then Nidati, you can take over.
Yeah, I think about Jane Jacobs, who's this famous urbanist who fought Rover Moses, who was really one of the big champions of putting highways through the middle of cities and displacing people, and trying to get people out to the suburbs and out of the cities and building this suburban experiment, that really has been a financial disaster, and I think I would argue a social disaster in a lot of ways, for our communities. And Jane Jacobs had these ideas about how do you create successful, vibrant, safe spaces. And one of her ideas was eyes on the street, right? How do we actually make it so that we have a relationship between buildings and the street where people are watching, and people are watching from different places, and people are home at different times of day and night. So you have eyes throughout the thing. So you have this safe walk that way. There are ways that we can make walks more pleasant, right? A lot of our buildings now are built for cars, and they're associated towards cars, which means they're really designed to ignore the sidewalk, right? They're not designed for a sidewalk. You have these drive-throughs not as an attachment to a restaurant, but basically as the main way you interact with the restaurant. That's not going to be a great place for having eyes on the street. There's no relationship between the sidewalk and that restaurant anymore. So we really need to think about, how do we create environments where the places you're trying to go to are associated, and the places along the way are also associated, have a relationship to the street, right? In that kind of way. And we could talk about some of the factors of what that is. It's the buildings are built to street, they're actually clear. They're not just solid walls that you're walking by, but there actually are windows so people can see through them. There are pleasant places to stop. There's shade right at places too. It can be, some of these walks are really things. The sidewalk is wide enough that you can get through it. You can pass someone else, or you can get through it on a wheelchair if you're traveling by wheelchair, those kind of things. And the other thing that's worth talking about here is housing. A lot of this sense of unsafety is people who have been pushed out to live on the streets, and people who have been unhoused, right? And that gives a real sense in a lot of our cities, of instability and a sense of unsafety, both for the people who are unhoused, right? And people feel uncomfortable walking by those places. I think safety is often higher than what people perceive. I remember living in Seattle and having actually a really good relationship with many of the unhoused people in my community, and talking to them on a daily basis and knowing them and having them talk to my dog. And, I would consider people like acquaintances and even friends in some cases. But that said, I don't think it's the best environment for anyone. And so we have to solve the housing problem. We know that when we increase housing supply, the cost of housing goes down if we do so sufficiently. And so figuring out how to build more housing is really key to creating that safety. It's also key to creating those eyes on the street, right? And that whole dynamic there. And the point I'm getting at here, when we think about creating a 15-minute city, when we think about creating safe walks, it's not just about thinking about the transportation itself. It's not just thinking about enforcement. It's not just thinking about transportation or housing or any one area of policy. It really does take a whole approach, right? And thinking holistically about the experience of being somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. As you're saying, like if USC itself is safe and the area outside is pretty bad, I think um that's a sign that like governments and should work together instead of just placing the burden of safe public transportation or just like walking in general for public safety. Um, I think we should make that a more collective effort instead of me saying that like certain towns, like, or one specific town has to cover for their own safety. I think it has to be a larger, more collective effort. Um, where like you look at another town and the uh municipality of a certain town is like, okay, we're also looking after that other town's safety. And I think there's more of a collective effort, and also more money is allocated towards things like surveillance cameras, having more active law enforcement or protection, or people just watching in general, especially at night. Making a more collective effort and consciously trying to change that, that'll first like deter more people from trying to commit crimes, etc. And it'll also contribute to people feeling safer, because they know that even if they're walking in a different town, they know that that's also part of the effort to make public transport and commute safer.
For sure. And honestly, we've kind of been dancing around my next topic for a minute. John, you mentioned restaurants, and then Nita, you mentioned like security and things like that. So my next question goes towards job availability. So starting off with you, Naradi, coming from a small town where you like were having experience living in a 15-minute city, how was that as far as like job availability, especially like for high schoolers and like people just getting into the workforce? How was like how available was that?
Most of the people that are, well, most of the parents that I know live around me don't really work here. Um, I first it's either whether they like worked somewhere else and then moved here, or they just don't work here. Um, but one thing that I have really noticed is that for me, my brother's a senior and he's pretty much done with like college and etc. So he's looking for a job like at a restaurant or um anywhere like that, and he cannot find one in my area because although there are a lot of new small businesses here, they're just not hiring because they're full, like they don't have room. And so he's been having to go other places pretty far away to just to get a job. And the thing is, like, most of the places that we go out to eat or for entertainment or just to have fun, they're around here. And because it is a 15-minute city, and so there are so many of these areas, and he can't really find a job here. um and yeah, I think that's one potential drawback of living in 15-minute city. He can't really walk to his job. And I'm not really sure how it is for actual, like, for adults, full-time jobs too. I'm not too sure how it is here, but I know there are a lot of spots. I mean, like, I know after COVID there were a lot of spots available. And I'm not sure how it is now, but there are a lot of full-time positions like that are filled. There are a lot of opportunities. Like, 'cause there are a lot of places to work here. It's just that I know for high schoolers it's not the best.
I think there are things that we can do around jobs and ability to access it. I've been really lucky. Uh, since since uh, since after college, I've actually always lived within walking distance of my job. I now work remotely, so now that makes it really easy. Now I live roll out of bed to my job. But previously I lived in Seattle. I could walk downtown to our office. Before I lived in Boise and could walk over to that. When we started a newspaper up in North Idaho, I could walk to the newspaper office that was nearby. And some of that was a conscious choice, right? If I'm going to pick a place that's near where I'm working. Um, and of course, you can't do that if the jobs aren't located inside of walkable places. Um, in Boston is a little different, right? You can get, like in Boston, for my brother who lives, we moved here. The reason why I live in Boston now is we drew a 1 mile distance around my brother's house. And we said, okay, we're gonna find somewhere to live that's within 1 mile so we can go see our nephew and niece and my brother and his wife as often as we want, right? So we sort of picked a walkable city within a walkable neighborhood within a walking distance of the thing that was important to us. And so that's just been really important to me. And I think we're seeing more and more people, right? I'm an older millennial, but I think we're seeing this more with people my age and younger, making choices to live near where they work when they can, right? And sometimes that means just saying like, I don't want to go to the office at all. I want a job where I'm working remotely so that I can live in the spot that I love to be in. And for other cases, it's saying I want to live in the city where there's jobs nearby me that I can actually walk to and go to, or that I can ride the bus to, or take the subway to. So I think all of that's true. That's the case for my brother and his wife. They can both get to their offices by taking public transit into the core of the city. So I think those are key things. And what I would say, one, that's a personal choice you have to make. And, you know, there certainly is jobs that I'd be willing to drive for that would be dream jobs. And I get those are choices we all have to make. But for companies and for business owners who are thinking about what they want to do, and thinking about how they want people back in the office, I hear a lot of that. You better make it appealing to be in the office. It better be in a nice place. It better be a place that's easy to get to. It better be a place where there's affordable housing that people can actually get to your place pretty easily. Because I think people are getting fed up with these long commutes. I think less and less people are willing to tolerate hours in cars every day. And I think there's a growing expectation of being able to either jump on a computer or be able to walk there or take public transit there. And I think that's going to be increasingly necessary to be competitive. And that means that you're going to be thinking about how are you creating these environments where that's possible, and taking a bigger interest in the affordable housing near where the headquarters is, if you want that to work out.
For sure. And then my last question, if I toss it back over to Alex, is when it comes to like straying away from like jobs and like that type of economic field, when it comes to like citywide and like renewable resources and things like that, do you think that could help with affordability, just having like making more use of like renewable resources, such as like maybe even making our buses electric, maybe instead of like gas, or things like that are kind of like, we haven't really talked about that yet. I feel like generally when people think of like urban planning, they don't think about like that side of it. So would that help anything?
Okay, I'm going to put on a different hat here, and I'm going to put on so I'm a board member at Strong Towns, where I'm a volunteer and do a Strong Town Fellow, where I go and talk to them about this stuff. At my day job, I'm the vice president for state and local strategies at the League of Conservation Voters, where one of the things we're trying to really talk about is this affordable clean energy plan, right, that President Biden endorsed and went out across the country. And it's all about making life more affordable, right, by making this transition to a clean energy economy. And so, yes, I think that's very true. And I think, yes, it's absolutely true that getting off of oil and electrifying our buses is going to help with those things. I would also say there are things we can do for weatherization in our homes that are going to make things more affordable. I think there are things we can do in actually having clean energy be close to us to make it more affordable. Also, by the way, having that clean energy close to you, right, is going to make it more resilient and more likely that it's not going to, lights aren't going to go off quite as often, especially if you're connected to a larger grid. So I think there's some reliability stuff that we can do there. I think there's some really great connectivity, I guess, to some of these policies around addressing climate, and also can do these things. And I want to emphasize these things are about people making their personal choices. These aren't things about government coming in and forcing you to do these things, right? Nobody's coming and taking away your gas stove, but there's an opportunity to actually have a more affordable thing with a different type of stove type. There's an opportunity for more affordability with weatherizing your home. There's an opportunity for more affordability with an electric vehicle. And a public transit that way. So I think those are connected. It's also true that just having to travel less by car is going to save you a lot of money, right? Having one less car is a big affordability issue. So I think at a personal affordability level, there's a lot to that. And I guess I would say like there is a connection to those kind of things that I can't help but mention when you ask me a question that directly. From more of a Strong Towns point of view, what I would tell you is it also makes our towns better off. When we build in this traditional pattern, right? We had this big thing in the 1950s where we did the suburban experiment, we call it, where we started building more for the automobile versus how people walk around. And for generations, for thousands and thousands of years before we had cities built around automobiles, we built cities for people to walk. It was a tested way to build places, right? We said, how can you get around by your 2 feet, right? And get around these places. And it was understandable. We thought, I think what we thought was, we have this more advanced technology, we'll build things in a more advanced way. But we're finding now is that experiment really was a failure, because the way we've built is requiring us to support all of this new infrastructure, all of these roads, but also means we're building buildings farther apart. So all of the pipe from road to road, all of the all the different infrastructure, right, from place to place. And it's really, really expensive. And we can't actually afford to support it. And so the great thing about a 15-minute city, right, is it's a new word and new branding that I actually don't think is probably the best branding, honestly. But the idea itself is solid. The idea itself has tested the time, and it's how you build places that are going to be fiscally like resilient, fiscally strong, right, and are going to last, right? That are going to make the test of time. If you look at the oldest cities in the world, some of the most popular places where everyone wants to go, and where people often in America will go for vacation, right, because they're such great places to be. They were built in this old school way for you to be able to get around by foot. You know, and even our amusement parks, right? When you go to Disneyland, what is it built in? It's built to get around on foot. It's built so you can get to all these things you want. You stay in a hotel where you can ride public transit into the park. When you get to the park, you can walk around and there are restaurants and there are rides, but everything is accessible. And they've even rebuilt that old traditional Main Street, right? Which is the heart of a 15-minute city. So that's what I would say is these are things that we love. They're things that test the test of time. And they're also things that will make us better off both personally, financially, but also make us as a community better off financially.
As for renewable energy, I definitely feel like it's a great thing to say that 15-minute cities, when they expand on public transportation and focus on making the energy used to support that renewable, I think it's great to say that obviously that would benefit the environment, but in order to do that, I feel like a lot of the cities that need it most or who are struggling the most with adapting to this renewable energy are those who can't really afford to make the investment now into changing their energy sources. And then it'll be less expensive in the long run, but a lot of people are stuck in the cycle where they keep having to rely on fossil fuels because they can't really afford to make the switch now. So I think in order for across the country or in general for towns, um, especially smaller towns who might not be as wealthy to make the switch, I think there needs to be more government funding and definitely more support for them to make the switch in their public transportation if their public transportation is to develop. And definitely from an individual perspective, I think as John was saying, maybe not having to spend money on another car can mean switching energy sources and um, using that money for other things that could involve renewable energy. But I think it's a lot more easy to adapt individually if there is money being saved on individual transportation, but there's not going to be as much money saved on public transportation. And so, if that is to switch to renewable energy, there needs to be more support for towns and cities to implement that.
That is so true. And it's what's so exciting to me about this Affordable Clean Energy Plan that I was referencing. There's at a personal level, I just want to note here is the money that's coming in to help towns make those things. I don't want to get too wonky about it, but I'll just talk about a program of some friends of mine in Georgia are working on where they're going door to door and helping low income communities actually be able to put solar up on their roofs using the new benefits, right? These new federal tax benefits that exist there so that they will immediately be able to lease these solar panels and see their rate go down on how much they're paying for electricity. Now that works, right? But we have to make sure that the transition to clean energy economy is done in a way that makes people's lives better off financially, that creates good paying jobs, that actually cleans people airs, that help people, right, in communities with coal fire plants and such to make those transition. And as those coal plants are shut down, new clean energy jobs are coming around and investments are taking place. I think one of the problems and one of a fair digs against environmentalists historically has been just a lack of caring about anything other than like, how are we cleaning the air? What's happening to the environment, right? And a focus on those things and not thinking enough about people. And so it's so important and what's so exciting about this Affordable Clean Energy Plan, right, is it does actually think about people. It actually thinks about the economics. It actually thinks about making things more affordable. And that's what's going to happen. Is that we need a transition that actually makes us wealthy and makes us richer, makes us better off. It cannot be a cost because I think this was so correctly stated by my fellow panelist here, right? Is that people we cannot ask people to sacrifice in this way who are already sacrificing a lot, right? We cannot come to them and say, we need you to sacrifice even more to make this thing happen and to make this transition happen. It needs to be an environment where we actually leave them better off than they were before. And the same thing is true when we talk about 15-minute cities, right? We need to make sure the way we build these cities isn't done in a way where people are able to stay in place, where people actually have a choice to actually stay in their community, that we're actually doing in a way that actually is like resilient and actually doesn't like make people lose their place and get pushed farther and farther out. We need to do it in places where we're not just making one part of town take all the density in, but actually in a gentle way, where we're actually having an increase in an equitable way across the community. We need to do it in a way that that listens to local people and is built from the bottom up, right? And where voices and community voices matter, and in a way that really tightly focuses on what's economically happening to individual families, what's economic and individual people, how are we focusing on real people in real places, is just so key. So I just wanted to build on that answer there, and just, I think there really is a key moment that we're in right now where we can really be successful, but absolutely right that we can have a laser-like focus and not ignore the hardship people are having.
So what does the future of 15-minute cities look like to both of you? Go ahead, John.
Oh gosh, I was just going on what's those 15-minute cities look like? Okay, here's what I think they look like along the lines I was just talking about. I think they come from neighbors talking to neighbors, and people coming together and saying, what do I want in my place? How do we want to build our place together? That's what I think it has to be. If 15-minute cities become just a concept that's pushed around by UN committees and global groups of people and elite folks out there, it's not gonna be an idea that actually resonates with people. It's gonna feel disconnected, it's gonna feel forced, it's going to feel, it's just gonna be unpleasant. And also, they won't build that good of places. We tried this with the suburban experiment to have everybody like globally plan these things and say, oh, here's what we're gonna do. You cannot create Jane Jacobs realities through Robert Moses means, right? You have to actually go and focus on the grassroots connections and community to actually get it done. And so to me, a 15-minute city comes out, does two things. One, it builds community, but it also comes out of community. It comes out of people together saying, what do we want to see in our community? What do we want to have nearby? How do we want to relate and build close relationships to each other? And it starts with people doing really simple things, even on their own blocks, right? It comes with people saying, how can I make my house have more relationship to my neighbors? How can I actually make sure that I'm actually out of, you make my front porch at night, or make an improvement, put in a street tree in front of my house, right? Or on my thing that shades a little bit there. Maybe I'll put a bench out there. Maybe there are ways that I can get together with my neighbors, and the activism can spread to there. How do we actually make it a little bit more walkable? What are the locations we need? A great place to start is, how do we make it safe for our kids to walk to school? How do we have safe routes to school, right, for our kids? Is a great place to start in building those 15-minute cities that really go back, by the way, to the past, right? It used to be that everybody could walk to school. If you talk to my grandparents, probably your grandparents too, they will tell you about how they walked uphill both ways to get to school, right? Now, oftentimes we can't walk at all. We'd like to walk, but we can't, right? So how do we make that walkable again in that way? So that's, to me, where it's really rooted in. It's rooted in community. And then as we make places rooted in community, as we get a local park put in, as we figure out how to make it so we can have more local businesses around the corner from us, right? As we figure out how to have housing that makes our community better, let's us build an accessory dwelling unit in our yard so that our mother might be able to move in with us as she gets older and has less mobility, or so that a kid can come home from college and have some independence but still be there, or that you can rent it out, right? So you can actually have your family be able to be a little more fiscally dependable. But all those kind of improvements, right? That gentle increase, that gentle change, we can slowly and steadily build a stronger place fiscally, build a stronger place with a stronger community, right? But it all starts with community. So it's a self-reinforcing cycle there. That's what I see happening with 15-minute cities. That's what I hope will happen. And I think people might use a 15-minute city home name. They might use, what else might they call it? They might call it a 20-minute city. That's Portland's name for it. They might say, oh, it's a little longer than that. They might call it new urbanism. They might call it a strong town. But I think what people will do most is what my fellow panelist was saying about this whole thing, which is, we're just going to call it home, right? She was saying, in my town, I didn't even think of it as 15-minute city until I got this term. It just always was one. That to me is the core idea of this thing, is they're just going to say, oh, this is my home. This is our community. This is just how we interact with the people. And so my hope is we get to a place where this isn't some newfangled idea, but a recognition of where we were in the past, and it just becomes normal. It just becomes how we live.
I definitely feel like it'll the idea of it will become, and people's opinions of it and willingness to implement them, I feel like they'll definitely become more polarized. And as is everything nowadays. But I definitely feel like as climate change gets worse and people are running out of options, I definitely feel like they'll resort to this a lot more. And as John was saying, it takes a community to even come to the realization that this is what they want. Um, yeah, I can see it definitely fostering a bigger sense of community. But also for the polarization part, I feel like there are definitely people who hate the idea of one, um, just purely because it seems like cramped to them. And so I definitely feel like there are people who will strongly oppose this, um, and go out of their way purposely to not live in an area like that. Additionally, I live in New Jersey. It's very dense here, so I can see them coming up more as population density increases because it's a pretty convenient way to avoid that or um, create more communities within an already very dense place. Um, but also, um, one example, like one very extreme example, one is I think the line in Saudi Arabia. That's they started construction on it, and that's kind of this concept of everything you need in one area. For here right now that we're talking about, it's 15 minutes, but in the line, it's supposed to be around 5 minutes. So I can definitely see examples of this idea being taken and um, turning it into extremes. But I think that it's a pretty healthy approach to solving a lot of issues like we discussed today, um, in a way that involves communities and people working together to really figure out what works best for them.
Great. Um, so my next question would be, do you think the general public will embrace 15-minute cities or not? Do you think that the idea to a lot more people is more of something that's in the past?
Will they embrace it? Well, I think if it's things like the line, which is really like a top-down big government, the government of Saudi Arabia saying we're going to build this thing, I don't think they will if we do it that way. I don't think it's going to work if it becomes something that's imposed or like it's a government program. We saw a lot of particularly like from the federal government of the United States. I think we can encourage. I think we create policies that don't break up cities and don't make it impossible to get through them and don't make 15-minute cities impossible. But I really do think it has to come from within the community. I really do think it has to come from people talking to neighbors. And then I think it will be popular. Although I do not think the 15-minute brand will last. I just think I get it in terms of like, oh, we want everything within 15 minutes, but I think it's become now a talking point. And I think if we talk about just traditional development patterns, or if we just talk about like, we want to have a nice community where we can walk around to things, um, you know, I think it's more likely to, I think there's other names that may work, but the idea has been around forever. I don't think we're at a point where we've passed the idea of building neighborhoods and communities the way we built them for thousands of years. And I think, and then if you need, will they be popular? I guess the other thing I would just say is they already are popular. If you look around our country, the most expensive places to live are places where you can easily walk around, right? There is nowhere more expensive than the heart of New York City, our most walkable city in this country, right? And the more walkable that neighborhood is, the more expensive it is. It's the same thing true here in Boston. The more walkable it is in Boston, the more expensive it is, right? Per a square foot. And same thing in Seattle, same thing in Boise, same thing in Salt Lake City. The more walkable places, same thing in the small town in Sandpoint, right? The more walkable it was, the more expensive it was for those things there, because people already decided with their dollars they want to have. This is what they want. This is where they want to live. This is where people want it. So it's already incredibly popular. It's what people are choosing to do. Now, on the other hand, as Naradi was saying previously, right? Some people aren't going to want to do this. Some people are not going to be fans of this, and that's okay. Our country has always had cities, and it's also had rural places. And you know what? we need rural places. We need farmers. We need the energy that's going to come out of rural places for wind and solar. And it's going to last. We need actually mining in this country still. We got to do it in a smart way, right? But we're going to need mining still. That's often going to happen in rural locations. So this idea that everyone's going to live in an urban walkable place isn't necessarily true. Some people, ranchers too, right? Some people are going to live out on the range. Some people are going to live in those places. What I think is important is that everyone lives in a place. And what do I mean by that? A place can be somewhere like a city where everything is happening, everything is going on. A place can also be out on the rangeland, or for that matter, out in the middle of a mountain somewhere, right? And you can't have the same expectations of services out there. You get a well, right? You have a gravel road. You don't have all the same amenities. We can't afford to like put everything out to you in the same kind of way in terms of infrastructure. You're going to live a different kind of life, and you're going to have different kinds of advantages living that life, and that can be really wonderful. So I think that's great. But what we can't continue to do is just build so much parking. What I always say is parking is the opposite of place, right? Parking is the opposite of place. You go to a big parking lot, that's where really nothing is happening. That's where really there is no life. There is no vitality. And what we've done is we've chosen to build parking rather than places. So it's great to have rural places. It's great to have urban places. It's great to have big cities and small towns, right? And that people who live out on the range. But what we cannot afford to do is continue the suburban experiment. That I don't think is going to last. And I don't think you're going to see it last because I think those places are going to go bankrupt. I think there's no longer going to be affordable. I think people aren't going to want those homes anymore. I think they're not going to be able to provide service level that they've had anymore because there's a whole Ponzi scheme around that in terms of we've used new growth to pay for the back growth, and eventually we just can't keep with that infrastructure. So that's what I think. Is we're going to have people live in rural places. We're going to have people live in, let's call them 15-minute cities. I'd call them strong towns, right? We're going to have people in those places. And I think people are going to love both. And I think our country is going to depend on having both.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Narati. What's your idea on it?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what John said about if the government really pushes this idea, I think it kind of creates a dystopian almost feeling to them, where it's like everyone's kind of in this bubble. But I think if communities just come together and decide that that's what they want, then I think it's a really healthy way to, as I was saying before, fix a lot of issues. Um, but also I think for the people who don't like it, it can be seen in like 15-minute cities are there in a lot of forums. For example, I got the opportunity to go to Norway over the summer, and a lot of their more like serene areas in the mountains and everything, those are pretty much, well, some of them are pretty much 15-minute cities. They're just a lot quieter and you don't really think of them that way. And also, yeah, I do feel like the brand of 15-minute city is gonna die out a bit. And personally, when I was even telling my mom about like what they were, etc., she kind of had this image of them. It's like a small town. And I think especially with the younger generation that's or my generation, Gen Z, I think that's a lot more appealing than the idea of a 15-minute city where you can find everything. I think it creates a more welcoming um it brings a more welcoming connotation with the term. If you describe them as like a small town or um a community, I definitely feel like that term will outlive the idea of like the term 15-minute city. I think the idea will continue to expand. I mean, those who don't like it, but I think for the vast majority, it's a really great solution. I just don't think it'll live on under the name 15-minute city, but uh, we'll definitely see it under different names. And as they have continued to um, appear all across the world, like for so long they've existed, I think they will continue to exist, and just this term will eventually die out. I think they'll continue to exist if not develop more and become more common.
For sure. Well, thank you, Anita, T, and John, for your thoughts on 15-minute cities. We're interested to see if cities will embrace this concept or start to deter it in the future. So looking forward to that. But thank you guys again for joining us for this episode of Allow Us to Explain. John, you mentioned Strong Towns. Would you like to do any social media promotion for your company or organization?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit organization, strongtowns.org. I'll also note that our founder, Chuck Marone, actually has a new book coming out on housing and housing affordability and how to escape the housing trap. It's coming out in April, so it'll be here soon, and worth reading if you've been thinking about how do we get affordability and how do we solve this problem of trying to think our homes as this major investment, but also needing to have more affordable homes. There's a real challenge there, and he really addresses that there. So I'd check out the book, the new book. I'd check out the website, strongtowns.org. And we just really look forward to connecting with more folks out in your audience to talk about how we can build strong, financially resilient places that are also great to live in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you guys again for joining us today for this episode. And thank you to our wonderful audience for tuning in with me and Alex today for another episode of Allow Us to Explain, especially because this is our final episode of the spring semester, but there's more to come in the summer. So make sure you stay tuned. You can follow this podcast and all of our other podcasts from our national conversation on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere podcasts can be found. And then you can also follow our national conversation on TikTok and Instagram at Our National Conversation, and on X, aka the new Twitter, at our NATL Convo. And finally, you can visit our website at ournationalconversation.org. Thank you guys again.
Thank you so much.